She was dragged from her bed in the dead of winter, pregnant, exiled, and left to die in the mountains. But what happened next didn't just defy the odds, it rewrote the meaning of survival, trust, and love. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story, it's a quiet revolution that will haunt and heal you long after the final word. There are some silences that feel louder than screams, the kind that live in the marrow of your bones, that wrap around your throat and steal your breath, not from fear, but from the bitter knowledge that you've been discarded, forgotten. Clara knew that silence. She wore it like a second skin the day her father led her up the Rockies just north of Aspen on a trail slick with ice and betrayal. She was 17, pregnant, and no longer welcome in her own home. The wagon jostled over frozen ruts, creaking with each turn. Clara sat hunched in the back, fingers still raw from the rope her father had used to drag her from her bed that morning. No words, no explanation, just a grunt and the sharp crack of his voice. You'll live with it or die with it, but not under my roof. He hadn't even asked who the father was, hadn't cared. She thought maybe he was taking her to a convent, maybe even to her aunt's, somewhere with walls, with people. But when they reached the clearing, a pocket of wind and pine and snow, there was only a man, standing alone in the cold like he belonged to it. He was taller than her father, broad, wrapped in a wolfskin coat beard, thick and black, a shotgun slung across his back, and eyes like polished flint. Clara's father didn't introduce them, didn't shake the man's hand. He simply pointed. She's yours now. Then he tossed a sack of oats from the wagon and turned the mule around. No farewell, no glance back. Clara stood frozen boots buried in snow as the only person who'd ever known her name rode off like she'd never existed. The man didn't say a word. Just motioned to the cabin behind him, then walked away toward a nearby shed, leaving her standing there like something left out in the cold. The wind bit through her coat. Her belly, barely rounding but unmistakable, ached with the weight of life and shame. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear into the woods, but the mountain held its breath, and Clara, shivering and hollow, stepped toward the creaking door. The cabin was simple. One room, a cot, a wooden table scarred with old cuts, a basin, a hearth pelts hung along one wall, a shotgun over the mantel. The fire snapped as if to remind her she was alive. She sat down by it, knees tucked beneath her chin. Her wrists throbbed. Her cheek still bore the mark of her father's backhand. Her heart, though her heart was silent. She didn't cry. She had no more tears. When the man Elias, she'd learn later, returned, he didn't speak to her. He placed a skinned rabbit on the table, sharpened his knife, and ignored her entirely, as if she were just another chore he'd have to tend to before spring. Clara watched him from the shadows. He didn't look cruel, just distant, as though the world had long since disappointed him and he'd stopped expecting anything better. That night, he didn't offer her the cot. She didn't ask. She lay on the floor near the fire, curled around her unborn child, trying to remember what warmth felt like when it came from kindness and not flame. The next few days blurred together. Elias rose before the sun returned after dark, always with something in hand, firewood meet a pelt. He never spoke unless it was necessary. She tried to stay useful. Washed the floor with snowmelt. Cooked what she could remember from watching her mother long ago, but everything felt like it belonged to someone else, even her own hands. Then, on the 5th morning, she woke to pain. It started low, a cramp that twisted sharp. When she sat up, the front of her dress was dark. Blood. Her voice cracked through the cabin. Elias burst through the door, eyes wide, axe in hand. One look at her, and the weapon clattered to the floor. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her up like she was weightless and laid her gently on the cot. She shivered. "Please," she whispered, "please, not the baby." He said nothing, just moved with silent precision, stoked the fire, boiled water, brought every fur in the cabin to wrap around her legs. She watched his hands tremble once, just once, as he pressed a cloth to her thighs. Time stretched, the bleeding slowed, the pain faded. She hadn't lost it. Not yet. Elias didn't leave her side that night. He sat against the wall, eyes on the hearth, arms crossed. "You cared," Clara said into the dark. His jaw tightened. "Don't flatter yourself." But his voice cracked just barely, and Clara, for the first time in days, felt something other than numbness. She felt seen. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside the cabin, beneath the hush of winter, something had shifted. The silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. And Clara, though still broken, began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't where her story ended, but where it might begin again. Trust, when it comes, after abandonment, doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in unnoticed, quiet as dust in sunlight. Clara didn't wake one morning feeling safe. She didn't suddenly believe Elias meant her no harm. It began in slivers and glances, in the way he started leaving an extra bowl at the table instead of just one. In the quiet way he'd move his chair a little farther from the fire to let her sit closer without asking. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, but the small shifts piled up like kindling, waiting for a spark. She noticed he mended her boots one day while she was outside gathering snow. The soles were patched with leather stitched roughly, but with care. No mention of it. Just the boots, warm and waiting by the door. Another morning she found a folded blanket beside her when she woke. New, not the thin one she'd used since arriving. It smelled faintly of cedar and safety. She didn't ask where it came from. She simply wrapped it around herself, as if by doing so she might wrap up something else, something broken. Outside, the snow melted inch by inch. Inside, time softened its edge. Clara began humming again. Not loud, just quiet little melodies she remembered from childhood, old lullabies her mother used to hum when no one else was listening. Elias didn't say anything, but she caught him watching once his work paused mid-motion, his expression unreadable. That was the thing about Elias, he never gave her words, but his silence wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. They spoke more little things. Once, while chopping roots for stew, she asked, "Why haven't you asked about the baby?" Elias looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Not my business," he said. "But I'm in your house," she replied. "I sleep under your roof." "You didn't ask to be," he said. And she couldn't argue with that. The words stung, but not with cruelty, with honesty. That night she found a brass bell on the mantel. Small, delicate, its clapper long gone. She picked it up and turned it over in her palm. Elias noticed. "It was my mother's," he said, voice low. Hung it by the door. Said it kept bad spirits out. "Did it work?" He shrugged. "You're still here." She laughed then. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in months. It startled her, startled him too, but neither of them said anything about it. From that moment things shifted, just a bit. Clara started brushing her hair again. Elias began explaining where he went each morning. Once he even brought back a sprig of wild sage and left it near the fire like it belonged there. One evening, Clara found a book in the old trunk under the cot. The cover was frayed, the spine cracked, but the words inside still held. She read aloud slowly, unsure if he was listening. When she reached a longer word, Elias leaned over. "What's that one?" She paused. "You don't read." His face didn't change, not well, so she showed him, letter by letter, syllable by syllable. That night became the first of many. Each evening, after the fire was fed and the tools were set aside, she'd open the book and they'd read. Her voice soft, his rough. The rhythm of learning filled the space between them, a quiet tether drawing two lives closer. It became their ritual. Not spoken, not planned, but necessary. Then came the day she slipped on the step. It had rained briefly that morning, and ice had crusted over the wood. She stepped out for snow, not wanting to disturb his sleep, and her feet went out from under her. The pain in her elbow stole her breath. Elias was at her side in seconds, voice sharp, face drawn. "What were you thinking?" She winced. "I needed water. I told you I'd get it. You were asleep." He crouched beside her, his anger dissolving into something harder to name. He reached for her arm, then stopped, noticing her flinch. "I'm not your father," he said, quieter now. Clara blinked. "You don't flinch like that unless someone made you expect it." She looked down, heart pounding. "I won't hit you," he said. "Not even if you mouth off." She nodded, not trusting her voice. And for the first time she believed him. That night she didn't lie by the fire. She took the cot. He didn't protest, and when tears came slow and unwelcome, she let them fall. Elias didn't speak, didn't comfort her. He just sat nearby, facing the fire, letting her cry without shame. The next morning, she found a wooden hairbrush on the table. Hand-carved. She ran her fingers over the smooth handle, and when she turned, he was already outside splitting logs. Trust isn't grand. It doesn't announce itself with speeches or promises. It arrives in pieces and kindnesses no one asks for. She began to wait for the sound of his boots at dusk. He began pausing longer before leaving each morning. They never discussed the past. Not hers, not his. But they built a present out of moments small, meaningful, silent. And as the days grew longer, as the snow melted fully and green returned to the edges of the world, Clara no longer counted the hours. She watched the firelight dance across the wooden walls at night, book open Elias beside her, and realized something remarkable. She was no longer surviving. She was beginning to live. It began with thunder. Not the kind that shakes the earth, but the kind that builds in your bones. Clara had known something was coming, had felt it in the tightness of her back, in the way her breath caught when she moved too quickly. Still, when her water broke just after sunset, and the first real contraction stole the air from her lungs, she wasn't ready. Elias was at the other end of the cabin stacking firewood near the hearth. When he turned and saw her gripping the table face, pale legs trembling, he moved without hesitation. The fear she expected to see in his eyes wasn't there. Only calm, only focus. He cleared the cot, boiled water, laid out towels he'd tucked away weeks before. She had never seen a man so silent, so composed, like he had delivered babies all his life. But she knew better. He was just the kind of man who faced storms head-on, no matter how uncertain the outcome. The pain was unlike anything she'd imagined. It came in waves, sharp, relentless, and she cried out before she could stop herself. Elias didn't flinch. He held her hand when she reached for him, let her crush his fingers when the pain crested. He didn't offer false comfort. He didn't try to control the storm, he just stayed. Hours passed. Sweat beaded on Clara's forehead, her nightgown soaked through. She'd screamed until her throat went raw, cried until her voice was just breath. Elias wiped her brow, whispered things she didn't understand, called her strong, called her almost there. And then finally a sound split the air that didn't belong to her, a cry, high and furious and alive. Clara fell back against the pillows spent. Tears streaked her cheeks. Elias cradled the baby, tiny, slick, perfect. He wrapped her in the flannel Clara had stitched weeks before without knowing why she bothered. Then, without a word, he placed the child in her arms. Clara looked down, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a dark swirl of hair, eyes squeezed shut but full of something ancient and knowing. "Lumen," Clara whispered. "She's Lumen. Light." For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel afraid. The next days passed in a quiet kind of awe. Elias moved like a man with a new purpose. He made porridge carried in firewood, cleaned without being asked. He held Lumen when Clara's arms ached, rocked her when she wouldn't settle, never with ease, but with care, with effort, as though he were building something sacred with every motion. He fixed the cradle, a piece of furniture half finished when she'd arrived, smoothed the wood with his knife until it shone. When she asked why, he just said, seemed like she'd need a place that was hers. The warmth in the cabin changed. Not just the fire, but something else. A hum beneath the floorboards. The rhythm of three people slowly becoming a kind of family. Elias had never been soft. Not in voice, not in face. But there were moments now, flickers when he looked at Lumen, and something in his eyes unlatched. Something buried long ago. Clara caught him once, just watching the baby sleep. His hand rested on the cradle like he was anchoring himself to it. "She looks like you," he said. "She's her own," Clara replied. "But I hope she grows to be like you." He shook his head. No. She should be better. That night, Clara reached for his hand. He let her. There were no declarations. No need. The fire spoke enough. As spring thawed the earth, Clara ventured outside with Lumen tucked against her chest. The mountain, once cruel and punishing, seemed to breathe with them now. Elias built a chair for her near the porch where she could sit and rock the baby while the sun rose. He left carved animals on the sill. Fox's deer, one odd-looking bear, each made with clumsy tenderness. He never admitted they were his. She never asked. One afternoon, Clara found him mending a pair of tiny shoes. "She won't need those for months," she teased. He shrugged. "She'll grow into them." She smiled, like I'm growing into this place. He looked at her then, eyes steady. "You were always meant to be here. The cabin just had to wait for you." They cooked together now, or tried to. Clara showed him how to fold dough, how to tell if the stew was too salty. He taught her how to tie a proper knot, how to split a log without wasting a swing. They laughed sometimes, not often, but it came easier now. The nights were still long. Lumen cried often. Sleep was a luxury. But even in exhaustion, Clara felt more whole than she ever had. One stormy night, as thunder rolled again across the peaks, Clara held Lumen close and whispered, "You were born in a storm. That's how I know you'll be strong." Elias sat beside them, hand resting on Clara's back. "You both are," he said. Later, Clara would write a single sentence in the back of that old book they read together. "This cabin was once only wood and nails. Now it holds us. It happened just after the snow melted for good, when the first wildflowers began to stretch their faces toward the sun." Clara had just begun to trust the silence, that precious quiet they had earned together, when a figure appeared on the edge of the trees. A boy, thin as a fence post, mud on his boots, coat too big. Not a man yet, but not a child either. Elias saw him first. He didn't reach for the rifle, but his shoulders went tense in a way Clara had learned to recognize. She stepped onto the porch, Lumen in her arms, and squinted through the late afternoon light. The boy raised a hand, hesitant. "I'm looking for Clara," he said. His voice cracked on the name. Clara took a step forward, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in months. "Who wants to know?" The boy pulled off his cap. His hair was longer, his face drawn, but the eyes were the same. Eyes from her childhood. Eyes she'd once shielded from fists and fury. "It's me," he said. "Nathan, her brother." The name hit like a stone in the chest. Clara nearly dropped to her knees. She hadn't heard it spoken in so long she'd almost forgotten how it sounded. They let him inside. Elias kept close, but silent, his presence steady. Nathan stared around the cabin like it was some kind of church. His eyes landed on Lumen, and something in him crumpled. "They said you were dead," he whispered. Clara sat slowly, the baby nestled in her arms. "Who said everyone?" "Father told the whole town you'd run off. Said you were shamed. Said you'd probably thrown yourself in the river." She felt Lumen stir against her. The warmth of her daughter's tiny breath grounded her. "Why are you here, Nathan?" she asked. His hands twisted in his lap. "Mama's sick, real bad. Coughs up blood now. They say she won't see summer. But before she goes, she told me the truth. Told me where he took you. Said to find you if I could." Clara couldn't breathe for a second. Her mother, the woman who had turned her face away that day, who had watched in silence while Clara was dragged from the house like a criminal. She knew Nathan nodded. She tried to stop him, I think, but she was too afraid. He told her he'd send her off too if she opened her mouth. Elias stood by the door silent as ever, but his jaw worked slow and tight. "And now?" Clara asked. "Why now?" Nathan swallowed. "He's gone. Vanished after the sheriff started asking about the preacher's boy. Turns out you weren't the only one he hurt. Things are turning in town. People are talking, asking questions. But Mama, she just wants to see you. She wants to say she's sorry." Clara looked down at Lumen. Her cheeks were pink. Her little fingers curled around the edge of Clara's shawl. "I don't know if I can go back," she said softly. Elias finally spoke. "You don't have to." But she did, not because they deserved it, but because something inside her needed to face what had been left behind. The next morning, she packed a small bag. Elias gave her one of his coats. It hung off her shoulders like armor. Nathan waited outside with one of the mules looking older than he ought to. "I won't stay long," Clara said to Elias. "I'll be here," he replied. The journey took a day and a half. Lumen was quiet most of the way, bundled close. Nathan didn't speak much either. When they reached the outskirts of town, Clara felt her chest tighten. The same dirt roads, the same crooked fence posts. But now people looked at her differently. Not with pity, not with shame, with something closer to fear. They found her mother in bed, frail as a breath, her eyes sunken. When Clara stepped into the room, the old woman tried to rise but couldn't. "Clara," she rasped. "My baby." Clara sat beside her, placed Lumen in her arms. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered. "I should have stopped him." "You should have," Clara agreed. The words hung there heavy and true, but not cruel. "I know," her mother said. "But I was afraid, and I failed you." There was no dramatic forgiveness, no weeping embrace. Just quiet, just truth, and a slow, fragile peace between them. Clara stayed 3 days, just long enough to watch her mother slip away, hand resting on her granddaughter's tiny back. Just long enough to stand in front of the sheriff and tell her story. Just long enough to see the preacher's son arrested and her father's chair left cold and empty. She didn't weep when she left the house for the last time. She didn't look back. With Nathan beside her and Lumen in her arms, she headed for the mountains. And when the cabin came into view, smoke curling from the chimney, Elias was there waiting. "You came back," he said. Clara pressed Lumen into his arms. "I told you I would." And for the first time in her life, she knew what home truly meant. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the bite of winter or the heaviness of grief. Instead, it whispered promises, carried scents of pine sap, and earth warming under sun. And it was in that soft unfolding season that Nathan first said it aloud. You too ought to be married. Not for show, just so it's known. So it's real in the way people recognize. Clara laughed, not out of dismissal but out of surprise. Marriage had never been a thought that stayed long in her mind. It felt like a word meant for other women, women who had not been treated like livestock, who had not rebuilt their lives in firelight and silence. But that evening, as Elias sat carving a rattle from cedar for Lumen, she looked at him differently. Not like a man who'd rescued her because he hadn't, but like a man who had simply remained. Through everything. And that more than any ceremony had already felt like a vow. Still, the idea settled in her chest like a warm ember. Elias didn't say much when she brought it up days later, only paused in his carving and nodded. If it's what you want, I think I'd like it, she said. But not big, not like in town. Just us. Here, where it's quiet. So it began. Nathan helped string simple garlands from wildflowers and pine branches. Bram, the old marshal who'd taken to living lower down the ridge, heard about it, and brought a bottle of elderberry wine he'd been saving since the war. Lumen toddled between everyone's feet, dragging a bouquet of dandelions and giggling at the birds. Clara made her own dress. It wasn't white, but a soft linen the color of the mountains in late summer. She hemmed it by the fire after Lumen had gone to sleep, fingers trembling only a little. Elias carved her ring from walnut wood, smooth strong. When he gave it to her, he didn't offer a speech. He simply said, "This came from the tree outside where you first stood when you got here." I thought it was fitting. On the morning of the wedding, fog blanketed the ridge, but by midday, the sun broke through in long golden bands. Clara walked out into the clearing barefoot, her hair braided with bits of sage and soft bluebells. Elias stood near the old spruce Lumen in his arms, his beard combed neat, his eyes gentler than she'd ever seen them. There was no preacher, no choir, just Bram standing between them reading from a book that didn't matter as much as the way his voice trembled when he said, "You may speak your promises now." Elias cleared his throat. "I promise not because I have to, not because anyone says I should, but because you are the first place I've ever wanted to stay. I'll build what you need. I'll stand when you can't. And when you're too tired to fight, I'll hold the line until you can." Clara's voice shook. "I don't have fancy words, but I know this I came here broken. And instead of fixing me, you gave me space to heal. You waited while I found myself again, and now I choose you. Not because I need you, but because I see you. And I want to walk forward together." They kissed under the pines, soft and certain. Later, they ate fresh bread and cheeseberries Bram had brought, and a sweet cake Nathan tried his best to bake. They danced slowly, no music but the birds. Lumen clapped her hands and twirled in the grass wearing a crown made from willow leaves. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now stood tall like a home built on trust and love. The days after the wedding passed in quiet rhythms. Clara continued teaching Lumen words and songs. Elias repaired the fence, added a new section to the porch. Nathan announced he wanted to stay on longer. Help with the garden. Learn how to track the way Elias did. The mountain around them seemed to settle into its own peace. The seasons turned and the world softened. Birds nested above the porch. Deer passed closer to the edge of the yard. The sound of laughter became as common as the wind. One evening, as the sky turned orange and lavender, Clara stood beside Elias on the porch, her ring catching the last of the light. "Do you think it's strange," she said, "that the worst day of my life brought me here?" Elias didn't answer right away. He looked toward the trees where the sun slipped through like liquid gold. I think he said that pain leaves room for something better to grow in its place. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have this. A home, a family. You didn't find it," Elias said. "You built it." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. They watched the light fade and the stars rise, and somewhere between the silence and the fireflies blinking to life, they knew they had crossed into something new. Their story had begun in silence, in brokenness, but now it moved with breath and belonging. Every creak of the cabin, every step on the worn floorboards, every whispered promise shared in the dark was proof that even in a world that often forgot kindness, love could still take root. And it could bloom, not loudly, not quickly, but surely and fully and forever. Clara's story is not one of grandeur, nor fame, nor triumph over kingdoms. It is the quiet kind, the kind that unfolds in the stillness of snowy mornings, and crackling fires and whispered lullabies and promises made not with rings, but with actions. Her journey began in abandonment and betrayal by the very man who should have protected her. Yet, through unimaginable pain, she endured. Not as a victim, but as a builder, as a mother, as a woman who learned to love without fear. Elias never swooped in as a hero. He was not the knight, not the rescuer. Instead, he was something far more enduring, a presence that stayed. He offered space when she needed silence, strength when she felt weak, and eventually warmth that melted years of cold. Together, they did not find a fairy tale. What they built was more honest. Through sweat and snow and heartache, they carved out a life that mattered not just to them, but to those who might one day hear their story and believe that love can come after loss, and safety can grow where fear once lived. The cabin under the pines became more than wood and stone. It became a haven. It held their laughter, their sorrow, their resilience. It became a symbol of what happens when two broken people dare to believe they are worthy of something more. From the moment Clara stepped into that cabin, unwanted and unsure, to the day she stood barefoot in linen to say her vows, she taught us something powerful, that healing is possible even in the harshest winters. That sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. That softness is not weakness, and survival is not the end goal, living is. Lumen, born of pain and carried by hope, became the thread that stitched them together. Her giggles filled the air where sobs once lived. Her tiny hands rewrote the narrative that had once marked Clara's life with shame. She is proof that something beautiful can come from something broken. So, what can we take from Clara and Elias's story? What lesson lives beneath the surface of these words? Perhaps it's this: life doesn't hand us redemption. We create it moment by moment with each brave choice to stay, to forgive, to love again. Healing isn't loud, it's slow. And it's found in the quiet moments when someone sees us, really sees us, and stays anyway. The resilience Clara showed, choosing life over bitterness, growth over fear, can be a map for us all. In a world that often glorifies dramatic victories and instant results, her journey reminds us that the small wins matter. A mended pair of boots, a word of kindness, a hand held during a storm. These are the threads of real strength. Her life tells us that beginnings are not always beautiful. Sometimes they start in darkness, in shame and loss. But beauty is not in where you begin. It's in where you go, and who you dare to become. In our current lives, we all carry wounds, some visible, some hidden. Clara's path reminds us that those wounds do not disqualify us from love or from building something whole. They are part of our story, but not its ending. Just like Clara, we can make choices every day to move forward, to let go of what tried to break us, to plant something new where the ashes once lay. Whether it's reconnecting with someone we've shut out, forgiving ourselves for past mistakes, or daring to dream again after heartbreak, we are capable of more than survival. We are capable of redemption. We are capable of writing a story filled with quiet victories. To anyone who has ever felt left behind or unheard, may this story be your mirror. You are not forgotten, you are not too far gone, and you are never alone in your struggle to begin again. And so, if Clara and Elias's journey moved, you gave you hope, or reminded you of something beautiful in your own life, we ask one small thing: please subscribe to this channel. Your support means the world, and helps us continue sharing stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain but heal. Stories that restore faith in slow, steady love and redemption after ruin, and in the strength it takes to stay when it's easier to run. Thank you for riding with us through Wild West Redemption. Until the next story ride, true love deeper, and remember, the quietest voices often carry the deepest truths.